Well, I think we can get started. Um, Ned, maybe we'll just want to introduce ourselves and kind of give a brief introduction before you go into your presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Katz. I'm a planner at Two Rivers Occoquechee Regional Commission. I work on a number of projects with the commission supporting the 30 towns within our region, including town plan updates, hazard mitigation, bylaw modernization, and this project on the rollout of the new FEMA flood maps, which you're going to be hearing a little more about today. Um, and Ned, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, nice to be with you this evening. Thanks for setting this up, Kyle, and it's great to be here. I am the Central Vermont floodplain manager, so I do deal with people in Orange County as the regional floodplain manager for Vermont DEC, and I'm helping to coordinate the work with communities through the regional planners around the state as the new maps come into effect over the next few years. So, thank you. It's great to be here.
And for this meeting, we're going to be diving into a few of the topics that uh, towns will kind of need to keep track of as we lead up to the rollout of the new flood maps. And Ned will get into the particulars of that. A lot of it has to do with, how do we keep the flood hazard bylaws up to date? What planning processes need to be ongoing right now versus in the near future. And as we're going through, I'm going to keep track of, if someone has a question or they put something into the chat, and I'm going to just, pipe up for Ned that, hey, there's a question here on this aspect, and we can dive into topics a little more thoroughly that way. Um, I think that's pretty much everything for the introduction. Is there anything else that you'd like me to introduce, Ned, or would you like to begin the presentation?
Yeah, that's great. That's fine. And I know that in the group that we have tonight, Kyle, there's people with considerable experience with, local planning and zoning and flood hazards and flood hazard bylaws and Kevin Geiger is here, I noticed. So Kevin, wonderful to have you with us. Um, so there'll be also hi, great to be here. There'll be lots of great opportunity to talk about stuff. I did bring a PowerPoint just to kind of bring up the topic and touch on all the big issues so we can kind of walk through it. It does have a fair amount of complexity to it on some level. And I would love you to stop me when you get confused by something and, signal to Kyle if I don't notice because I'm looking at a presentation screen and, either raise your hand in real life on your video or by electronically raising your raise hand button in the middle of your screen there, or putting in chat. Anyway, I'd love to be able to clarify things as we go along, and then at the end, get into some more of the big questions that might come up that you'd like to discuss with other people in the room. So, great, thanks. Here we go. Let's give it a try. Okay, share. And I somehow have everything up except what I want to have up. Okay, does everybody see the screen with the water? Okay, thanks. That's good to know. All right, great. So thank you for being here. And we're just going to do a general update about what's going on with the FEMA flood map update process and what that might mean for your community in terms of bylaw updates or not in both Orange and Washington and Windsor counties. So this is a process that's going to involve all of us, municipal officials, select board members, planning commission members, our communities, Kyle and the folks at the regional planners at Two Rivers, And then for Vermont DEC, both John Broker Campbell, who is the regional floodplain manager in Windsor County, and myself, who works in Orange County and Washington County. So we're going to talk a little bit about the map update process that's underway, what's going on with FEMA and the FEMA contractors, and what that timeline looks like. We'll be talking a little bit about the bylaw update process as it might affect your community or not. So kind of the municipal level of all this. And then I'll also want to talk a little bit about the model bylaws that your community may want to look at and consider focusing on no adverse impact. So as we know, floodplains are both a terror and a dangerous thing, but also in many ways a very positive thing. I just want to just start with that floodplains function in many ways for us as places to store and move flood water and ice and debris and sediment. It keeps the water in our rivers and lakes and estuaries clean by allowing a place for the sediment to deposit out and the nutrients to deposit out. It enriches the soil, also places with important roles with groundwater recharge. These are often very important to us as places for agriculture to feed us and for forestry in part, wildlife. And often these are the centers of our community, places that we go for joy and mean a lot to us. They're also places that are critically important to be thinking about because they are what's important for reducing flood levels, flood heights, and how fast the water shows up in town and how much power it has as it comes down the hill into the village and into communities downstream. So FEMA is the federal agency that runs the National Flood Insurance Program. It actually started under HUD back in 1968. But these are basically the kinds of maps that were first generated in Vermont for us to work with. And it's tricky stuff. They're really basically Agency of Transportation maps of the time, somewhat informed by USGS topographic maps with 20-foot contours, and some people that had an eye to what they're talking about that would do the best job they could by eye. And many interesting problems with the map. Some places more studied than others. So across the state, there are towns that FEMA doesn't even know are there. There are towns that have no maps. There's towns that have a flood hazard boundary map, all the way through having flood insurance maps, maps with floodways, sometimes separate, sometimes together, lots of combinations. So in the upper left, the flood hazard boundary map, bottom left, the flood insurance rate map, floodway map, and finally in the upper right, we're getting to something that we're more familiar with today, particularly in Windsor County, which is a digital flood insurance rate map, which has multiple ways you can work with it. And you can actually see aerial photographs, find your way around it much more easily. This is a quick look at a current firm flood insurance rate map from Bennington County, where some of the quality is somewhat higher in the terms of the process of what they generated. And so in the map, we can see an aerial photo with the channel. Also, you can see the red area, which is the zone AE special flood hazard area, the area the community is responsible for. In the bottom left, you can see the amber zone A, which is a special flood hazard area the community is responsible for. And then also features such as the hatched area there closer to the channel, which is the floodway, an area that's protected as a right-of-way for the water during flood stage, and areas typically characterized by more frequent flooding and more higher velocities, more power, more damage, places to be very particularly careful of. And then there's lines where there are these studies, which are cross sections across the valley, establishing essentially how high the water will come. In this case, 542 feet, 0.7 NAVD across the valley there. And in the gray zone, the bottom right, you're seeing an area which is basically the 500-year flood or the 0.2% annual chance event. And some events like Tropical Storm Irene were essentially on that scale or larger So it's just a different way of representing another size flood that's going to occur in this area. So looking across the state, roughly half the state has DFIRMs, digital flood insurance rate maps, including Windsor, Wyndham, and southern Vermont in general. And northern Vermont typically does not and has really basically paper versions of maps or scans of paper versions. So Wyndham and Windsor, basically those maps became digitized, became effective 16 years ago. So a lot of our communities in Windsor County went through a whole process at that time, and we're kind of going back to revisit that on some level now today. Some places like Newbury and Bradford 24 and 32 years ago got new maps, and then other towns in Orange County 48 years ago we got maps on paper, one version or another, and really hasn't changed very much except sometimes the name has changed. So this about due to get something that actually is more up to date and easier to use. This is a schematic with the official process that FEMA would tell us about for the map update process under risk map, the current variety of how they're doing the work. So the key message is at the very end, which is the projected or the effective date. That's the date when the map goes into effect, it becomes official, and the old one is no longer official. There's a period where there's a little bit of transition going on there. And then the other date that they're going to point to that's really important is the LFD, the letter of final determination. And when that comes out, bang, that gets issued, and it sets a date 6 months out when the map becomes official. But somehow 6 months is not really enough time to do a whole lot in town. And so what we got to do is figure out what do we have to do and plan appropriately to make sure it's all nice and smooth and graceful and inclusive, and we do the best job we can. So in part, we're just kind of looking backwards more into where we are now. Pretty much all the areas in Vermont have gone through a discovery meeting already, and contributed their ideas and what they find to be important back to the FEMA process and the contractors. And what we're looking for next is the work map meeting. So in Orange and Windsor counties, we're going to expect a series of invitations to look at maps as they become ready for different watersheds where the town is included in that watershed. So watch for that and look for those maps and make comments. That's the best thing to do to make them as strong as they can be, as clear and as effective as they can be. But that's still coming. Likely, we're going to hit several of those. Maybe just one in your town here, one in the town over there, but across the county, several. And the last one is the one I'm kind of watching for Orange County and Windsor County, because that sets a rough working timeline before everything becomes due. So what we're looking for after that is this date that I call the prep date. And that's basically, we got to have anything that we have to have into FEMA should be into FEMA by that date. And that means that, with any bylaw work that does need to be done is completed and they have it, because otherwise things get complex. So somewhere between this last work map meeting and today and that last work map meeting and the prep date, we're likely to want to do an update to bylaws that we have in the community. And some towns may need to or wish to also update one of their plans, such as their municipal plan or their local hazard mitigation plan. And Kyle has a lot of the data about this and is happy to follow up and answer questions about where that's at and clarify any of these things. And I can help out where possible. On the left, you can see a schematic of the state, and you can see that under risk map, this new method of doing map updates, they're studying the flood risk by watershed, which makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, each county they're going to issue the maps by county. and each county overlaps several of these. So again, looking at our situation, I think we're likely to see the last work map meeting in the county for Orange County and also for Windsor County, probably next winter, probably next year at this time. So we still have a little bit of breathing space here. So, and then after that last work map meeting, probably a couple of years to finish up our work, including bylaws, possibly including plans, in a lovely, graceful, inclusive, and involving way with the community. And at the bottom, maybe Kyle can put some of these in as we go along, but I know, Kyle, you have a bunch of handouts too, right? You're going to share with people with links to things. So yeah. So at the bottom, you can see there's a shortcut there for bit.ly, bit.ly/FEMA-map-update. So that's a really good page at the flood training site where I'm trying to keep it up to date for what's going on county by county. So peek at that from time to time, and the information will change. So with the map work underway now, they're really flood studies of various types, and they will also generate maps to work with in our communities to identify areas affected by flooding, and deserving our attention to avoid damage. So the number one thing to be aware of is we're going to get new Zone A information. And so Zone A are areas, if you're familiar with flood maps, are areas that don't have base flood elevations on them at all. They are the sketchiest versions of special flood hazard areas, but they're being generated in this go round from much higher quality information. They're using the 1-foot contours that we have wall to wall across Vermont from LIDAR, and they're using one of two different methods. In both Orange and Windsor County, they're going to be using 2D base level engineering, basically computer-based modeling of actual landscapes, actual discharges, and actual hydrology as it moves through the landscape from 2-foot by 2-meter by 2-meter pixels through the landscape. So they're able to show where that happens. That's a big gain right there. It's going to change. It's going to clarify a lot of pretty curious Zone A situations. The other thing we're likely to get is a lot of redelineated Zone AE existing studies, using the new higher quality topographic information from LIDAR, the 1-foot contour value topography. So in places like the First Branch, or the Ampampanusic, or the Ottaquiche, they're going to use basically the existing studies that they did already in the WAPAC, and they're going to adjust them to fit onto the higher quality landscape information. And then finally, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, Kevin has a question.
Oh yeah, sure.
When we get to a transition.
So Ned, on the Zone A's, does that mean we'll have better mapping on the Zone A's and they'll still be Zone A's, or will we actually get elevations at all on the Zone A's?
Yeah, and you're one of the few people in the room that's going to know the difference there, but you're right. No, they're still going to be Zone A's. They're going to still not have official BFEs on them, but in truth, they were built with cross sections through a computer process that we're not going to ever see the cross sections. We're not going to have access to the cross sections. But if you draw a line across the stream or the river with the Zone A, and you line up the contours on both sides, it's going to come in, with less than a foot. I mean, the difference is going to be really tight.
Oh, right good. Now,
yeah.
Yeah, because I'm sitting on a Zone A right now, and there's like 30 feet of difference between one side and the other. The water kind of sloshes. Okay, good.
That's different.
So that was one question. The other question is, we're going to get a lot of small streams added.
That's right.
Do we have any idea if those will be Zone A's or detailed?
Zone A.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have an image about that just about to show up, so you'll see that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Sure. So Zone A was going to be new and very different, and much more extensive and much more detailed in character. Also, again, redelineated Zone AEs on the larger rivers and streams that we have mapped now with base flood elevations. And then finally, some, not a lot, new detailed studies with Zone AE and floodways. So here's an image to Kevin's point. On the left is a current Zone A in Washington County, which is pretty good. It was constructed in part with better topography at that time. But you can see it's kind of a rounded shape, basically saying, you know, the stream's here and there's a flood risk in association with it. On the right is you can see the same area mapped through 2D base level engineering. And so in this case, the blue hatched area will be the new Zone A, and the amber area hatched is actually a computer-generated 500-year flood hazard area associated with it through modeling. So you can see two different levels of information as an outcome of this process. Pretty fascinating. And I think that's one of the things communities may want to be thinking about is how to handle this more information in terms of avoiding known risks. On the left in this image, you can see the current flood insurance rate map in this area, and you can see they're kind of rounded off areas, and here's the floodway coming through, and the blue areas are the Zone AE with special flood hazard areas with base flood elevations. And then on the right, you can see the same area that has basically been redelineated using the 1 foot contour. So in this case, in many ways, very similar, slightly more wiggly edges, more detailed because it's responsive to a more high quality topographic information. In the upper corner, you can see this gray zone coming in. That's a new Zone A coming in that wasn't previously picked up. And then off over here, actually light blue, and off of here in the upper right-hand corner is, again, another feature of this two-dimensional base level engineering. It's picking up these areas, and they model out by the computer as a Zone A, as an area subject to 1% annual chance of flooding, what you'd call a special flood hazard area, Zone A. But because it's in a very high area with a small watershed, they're just going to label it a 500-year flood hazard, like the Great Brown area down here, because they're just not quite as sure about that. But we're going to have the data, so that's something else to look at. Yeah.
On that, is that like one of those upland wetland areas?
Yeah. Chances are most of these are associated as wetlands and beaver flowage and stuff like that. But it'll be interesting, you know, as we see the maps in our community, to go back and look at that, check it against hydric soils and stuff. A lot of that is no doubt going to be pooling areas, you know, just that sort of thing. Yeah. This is a quick schematic of the areas with detailed studies around the state that FEMA is requiring the contractors to go into and do on the ground work to model the flood hazard areas with bridge information and other kinds of information that needs to be in the model. So we can see in this case the White River coming up, and you can see that it actually picks up a little bit of the second branch up into Randolph, a little bit of the Upper White. This coming in from other studies that were already previously done. The Connecticut River is actually getting a completely fresh, detailed study, almost stem to stern. A little section of Barnard Brook is getting studied, connected to Woodstock. The Ottaquechee is not being studied. A little piece of Stevens Branch up in Williamstown. So that's what we got. We're not getting the first branch. We're not getting the Ampompanoosuc or the West Branch thereof. So anyway, a lot lighter level of what they're able to fund to pick up for more detailed studies. And we're still not sure if they're going to pick up anything in Bennington County. Still watching for that. These areas where we have existing studies, like on the Ampompanoosuc and the Ottaquechee and so forth, again, they're going to be detailed to this higher quality topo and be much more intricate and precise on some level, but they may not be as accurate. They'll be as accurate as they are right now, which is to say they're based on old studies. And the FEMA work is all required under law to use, best available data about what has already happened in the past and to model that for our communities. However, the past may not be the future. So in this case, you can see this is a USGS gauge up on the Mad River. And you can see actually this is how high it came in November 1927, how high it came with Tropical Storm Irene in August 2011. And actually the Q100, that's what's being modeled on the maps, is much lower, even though these are both within 100 years. The old data is not actually being improved to acknowledge the existing hydrology, let alone what's likely to come in the decades ahead. So that's the downside to these studies that don't get updated with new hydrology. So the message I really want to carry tonight in part is that as we look at the maps, we also thinking about what we're going to do with them and the importance of what we call no adverse impact to both the special flood hazard areas and river corridors together, thinking about these things. And the idea is that these are actually areas that are functioning and helping our communities. We're trying to protect the room needed by the river to adjust over time, to erode and deposit without freaking everybody out and wiping out roads and culverts and houses, and to thereby also manage its energy better and keep its floodplains functioning. And we're trying to protect the floodplain functions at the same time. So the floodplains are in essence the brakes on the watershed system. And if we don't have the floodplain functioning, then all the water shows up at once.
Ned, we have a question in the chat from Ira, essentially asking if towns are expected to update or readopt their bylaws within that 6-month window after we get that preliminary work draft of the map.
No. Which is good news. In Massachusetts, the answer would be yes. And it really depends on state law. So typically, as I was trying to indicate before, the FEMA process just basically gives us all of a letter of final determination, at which point that's kind of the starting gun. And for most of the country, decisions are made on a county-wide basis. And so, the county supervisors are kind of queued up. They get a letter of final determination with a date, and they adopt new bylaws with a new date. And it goes through kind of quickly, perfunctory on some meeting on a Tuesday. In New England, it's a lot more complex. And in Vermont, we have the ability to adopt language, which is basically automatic adoption, the current and effective maps. And by having done that ahead of time, when the new maps show up, in whatever date, they are automatically, the maps we're using by our intent as a community. So we can do it ahead of time is the good answer. And in terms of whether the towns need to adopt new bylaws or not is a more complex question. It could be, we're still talking to FEMA to clarify this, and answers will be coming, but it could be that, if your town adopted a bylaw back in the day and if FEMA approved it on their database, the last time we did this in Windsor County, FEMA may say, it would be great to update, but you don't need to. Or they might say, we want to see each of them and we want to check them against the things that we care about right now, because we're much more concerned about, X, Y, and Z, particularly things like substantial damage and so forth. So we're still waiting to get a signal on that, to be honest. So what I'm saying here is there is a model, no adverse impact standalone model that you could look at as a community one way or the other. You don't have to use it, but I would encourage you to, because I think has strong standards, standards of avoiding loss to the functioning of flood hazard areas and river corridors, protecting our communities better, and particularly vulnerable people and businesses that are already in hazard areas and don't want more water coming faster. And it helps all of us afford living in and near rivers and enjoying them. The key elements in the model, in terms of the values in it, for this no adverse impact, is to say within the river corridor, area near the river and stream, don't build any closer than what's already there within that identified area. Within the special flood hazard area, no fill or no net fill to block up areas that actually are functional for places for water to be, flood water to be, and to deposit silt and to not rush down the hill. And then with construction in the flood hazard area in particular, that the lowest floor of the building, the lowest floor elevation being at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. And that's for a variety of reasons. One, the higher the better. Two things happen that are really not part of the flood. Floods come in all sizes, including larger than the base flood. And we don't know what's happening in the future in terms of the base flood. So a 2-foot margin is a standard that's used in the state regulations for state facilities and VTrans stuff and ag buildings and all that sort of stuff that are under regulation through the state flood hazard area and river corridor rule. And it's recommended as a place for the communities as well. So why not add fill to a floodplain? It's just a big shallow spot in the landscape. But on the top, you can see here's the house near the stream. There's a flood going on before development. And then down below, there's a fill pad, new development going on. And that basically deprives the river of a place to put its water, for its water to go. And it gets deflected onto other landscapes, buildings, your neighbors, your nearby landscape roads and culverts. So by deflecting the water, it causes damage to others, people that otherwise would not have been at risk, perhaps. Why protect river corridors? Several reasons. One is it's known to be a place that's close to the water and subject to erosion, and it could be a place that's hazardous to be putting all the things you love. It's also got other reasons why it's important to the functioning of the floodplain and the watershed. So on the top, we have a house placed down close to and too close to the stream. It gets damaged during flooding. Then because of that, there's a lot of action that takes place here, expensive work to armor the bank and protect the house, sometimes to elevate it, sometimes to dig out the channel, whatever they can do to try to keep their investment and family intact. That eventually drives the channel deeper and deeper and deeper, and eventually the bank fails. And there goes the house, there goes the road, there goes all the damage that we're very familiar with in our region. So this is basically the process of incision. And whenever we can avoid getting that close to the stream, we can avoid some of those consequences. So a vicious cycle, a positive feedback loop with bad outcomes, high flows causing flooding and erosion and damage. A lot of times at that point, people do whatever they can afford to do to protect their buildings and their investment, their family, their well-being. And that runs the risk of depriving the stream and river of its ability to get to its floodplain and slow down. And it makes it more likely that there'll be damage to adjacent roads, culverts, bridges, and neighbors. So we're trying to get out of this trap. So river corridor is really understanding that over time, rivers and streams change position in response to their water, their weight, their energy, their sediment, their debris. How do we anticipate that and stay out of the way and have a happy day? River corridors include the extent of this meander belt when it comes to its full expression and takes its least gradient path down the valley, least energy, least erosive, least destructive. And it includes an area nearby which creates space for a stable bank. So when people, come up and they end up building their houses right up against any line that you put on the land, they come right in. And when the river channel kind of erodes its way down here closer and closer to the house, and the house owner freaks out, and they insist on riprapping. Well, the riprap would not necessarily deprive the meander belt of the room it needs to achieve this form. Whereas right now, a lot of houses are, the existing houses can be quite far in there and make it very difficult. So the river corridor is, again, includes these mapped areas you can see on the flood ready map and the A&R map, A&R Atlas map, and also includes smaller streams that are not actually mapped, but they're shown as lines on the atlas, and they're actually not so much extents, but it basically just flags them as being a stream with more than a 0.5, a half square mile watershed. And in really dealing with that stream, you measure the actual functional area needed as 50 feet from the top of the bank. So in the real world. And so that's all on the Flood Ready Atlas. The Two Rivers Regional Commission has a viewer for flood hazard areas and river corridors, and Pete has put up maps which include actually the small streams shown, but with actual buffer dimensions. So you can actually get a sense of kind of how these function on a real landscape as small streams. But again, this is not actually the real dimension. The real dimension is still in the landscape from the top of bank on the small streams. So again, room for rivers. Don't build closer to the river than what's already there, and that's stays out of the way of harm, and also provides room for the river channel to adjust and to achieve its least erosive path down the valley. This is one of the curious things that you might see when you look at the bylaw, the model bylaw, about how do you do this in the real world, and especially in a village setting, a hamlet setting, or downtown. So how do you do no adverse impact on river corridor functions in built landscapes? And so there's some ideas about how this goes. In this case, you can see the river channel flowing by, and nearby in this brown area, we have the river corridor. And over here, we have this idea about a shadow. So in this case, we have a brown house, a pre-existing brown house, already too close to the river. But because of that, if somebody wanted to build onto that house an addition, or you wanted to put on a garage or accessory dwelling unit or something, and if it's within 50 feet downstream, or it's further away from the river than the existing house, this is all area where you could build, and it's really no place that the river can ever get to. The assumption here is that the owner of the house is going to really, armor the bank for a couple hundred feet and protect it from the river when the river gets closer. And when that happens, this is an area where, again, it's already lost to the river. So it's not going to have an adverse impact anymore on what's available to the river and its ability to adjust and achieve its least erosive form. Same thing in this case for the septic system. Here's a septic system below ground, and we would look at it the same way, that basically within 50 feet downstream or further back than the existing channel, it would be no worse than it is right now for the ability of the river or the stream to come to its equilibrium. So this is all a place that could be conceived of for developing a replacement septic and so forth. The other idea is this infill concept. And here we are in the village or the hamlet. And in this situation, we have a couple of existing houses. And if they're so close together at a certain scale, there's no way that we can allow the stream or the river to come in between them. There's just the owners of these houses are going to have to be riprapping, for distance to both sides to protect them. And there's no way you're going to squish a river channel in and out in that space. So, if it's inside of 300 feet between a couple of existing buildings, then that's all an area that you could really conceive of putting other structures, similar structures or accessory structures, and it's not any worse than it already is. It's not any better. It's not any worse. So it's no adverse impact on the function, still doing the best we can for the community. So how can we avoid losses due to flooding? We can make a plan as a community, as a family, that is. So we can get a kit together, emergency kit. We can practice our plan. We can update our plan. We can get flood insurance. We can get all the other kinds of insurance we can in order. We can relocate our structure or elevate it. None of that is easy, particularly elevating or relocating. It's not something that people can do readily without a tremendous amount of work, with help from people like the regional planners and community officials. At a community level, we can be adopting regulations to avoid known hazard issues and known hazard areas, not be aggravating the problem and the risk to structures and families and friends and assets already in the hazard zone. We want our roads to work. We want to be able to get to school and to get to work. We don't want to make it harder and harder to keep our roads together and our friends intact. We can take steps to be reducing the existing exposure by helping support people that want to move out of the flood hazard zone and restore function. We can be improving our emergency responses to these situations, which is very hard in towns that have limited number of people that want to be doing E911 calls in floods. And as the state and federal level, we could be developing the data, the maps to identify inundation and erosion hazards, provide model regulations, and develop incentives for communities to avoid known hazard areas and to not be making it worse. So that's the cue to talk about ERAF, which is probably familiar to many of us, the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. And so after some sort of a flood event or any sort of federally recognized emergency or declaration, emergency disaster declaration, in that case, basically federal funds will come and pick up 75% of the loss to the community of eligible expenses. That still leaves a big chunk of expense. And in Vermont, the state will always pick up 7.5% as well. And that still leaves this burden that gets picked up by the community taxpayers across the state. If the community, on the other hand, has picked up some of the responsibility by being in the National Flood Insurance Program and having an emergency operations plan or hazard plan, or having road and bridge standards, and have all of those together, then the state will split that last little bit. And if in addition, the community is also adopting river corridor protection, then the state will pick up the largest portion of that, leaving the smallest share of disaster costs to the community. So it's an incentive to help basically insure the municipality against some of those budgetary losses when another federally declared disaster hits us, which they do. There's data for us on the community reports at the Flood Ready website. A lot of different information about where we're at and how the ERAF is doing and steps that different communities have taken. Happy to get any feedback.
Ned,
yeah.
It does look like there's a question from Ira.
Okay. One more question. Is that ERAF funding available to private landowners, homeowners as well, or is that just for town expenditures and on public lands?
It's really for, yeah. So the flood insurance program, NFIP, is for private landowners, really for structures only, per se. There are other funds that can become available to help with things that sometimes can become available to help with other kinds of damage. ERAF is really set up for the municipalities. And it's really, again, an incentive for communities to take more responsibility for these known hazard zones. So
and those funds will be used for rebuilding roads, for instance, and
that's right. That's right.
Public facilities that are damaged. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Since I have
related to the public assistance program, really. Go ahead.
Okay. Maybe I can shoehorn one more question in here too. Yeah. This is about the old fluvial erosion hazard zones. You'll remember the 2010 flood hazard area bylaw in Sharon incorporates those zones, anticipating some amount of erosion during flood events. Is the new mapping, is the special flood hazard area kind of absorbing those zones now under one moniker, or will we actually see the flood zone edge effectively retreat toward the river a little bit with the adoption of the new maps? in towns that have a fluvial erosion hazard zone adopted currently.
Yeah, so these are two different things. Let me see if I have another image coming up here that can speak to this. No. Um, so let me go. Basically, there's two different pieces of information that you're using in Sharon. One is the special flood hazard area, and which has its own dimensions, and that's what's being updated by FEMA right now. And when they finish, Sharon will have a new study for a zone AE and floodway through the White River in the middle of the community. So much more defined special flood hazard area in that area, and also in newly redelineated areas on Broadbrook and so forth around the rest of the community. And then in terms of the other piece I'm talking about, river corridors, that's another piece of information about the movement of the brook from time to time, from side to side. And in the case of Sharon, the community adopted an early version of river corridors, which we call the fluvial erosion hazard area. And essentially, the fluvial erosion hazard area is really only the meander belt itself.
Yes.
And doesn't create the area by which the bank is stable and new structures are set back enough that they could protect themselves without encroaching into the meander belt. So that's the difference. So there are two different things. So basically, the fluvial erosion hazard area is analogous to the river corridor, but they're different kinds of information. Yeah.
Okay. And so, if anything, we're likely to see the boundary of the FEH zone or the river corridor grow a little bit to account for the buffer that's needed as well. We're not going to see landowners with acreage encompassed by the FEH sort of regain the ability to occupy more of that land.
For the most part, they're based on the same data. They were reconstructed. In the case of Sharon, pretty much everything in Sharon was done with phase 2 data, which means field work, people working up and down the stream, getting information about valley walls. And so that all would be incorporated into the new version of river corridors. And you can see the river corridors now on, again, the Flood Ready Atlas and the A&R Atlas. So you should look at those and compare those to what you have. Yeah.
Okay. I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the questions. Yeah. Anything else that come up for anybody? Yeah. Great.
Evening.
Hi.
I own property on the Tweed River in Stockbridge.
Yeah.
I am a real estate broker,
Mm.
and I'm on the select board in Rochester, which is dealing with what we were going to do with our former high school. So how do we approach these upcoming, this is still 2 to 3 years away. How do we approach it today as to finding the right path on what we're supposed to do? As a realtor, I'm warning people that flood maps are being redone.
Yeah.
But I don't have any answers right now. And
right.
for the high school, we're moving property lines to take a floodway away from a building. Are all those efforts going to be for naught because we're expecting that particular area to be expanded? So it's difficult going forward when we know we're in this state of limbo. Is there somewhere where we could go to pinpoint a specific property to help us right now?
Actually, in your case, yes, which is kind of unexpected. But so in Rochester, again, the whole process is underway, and you're going to see things come by. So again, watch for the work maps to come out, and that'll be the best thing to look at and to ask questions about and have corrected when that shows up. But in terms of the main stem of the white coming through Rochester, that's already been done. And so you may have even seen it because after Tropical Storm Irene, USGS went through and actually did an updated study based on the higher quality LiDAR that was acquired at that time in very specific, important state highway areas. And so they flew very narrow bands. Now we have it wall to wall across the state. But within those very narrow bands where there was a lot of damage, USGS was hired to go and do an updated study. So I think what they're going to do basically is incorporate that study into the new work maps when we see them. So you can actually look at that information that was provided to the community at that time. I'm sure Two Rivers has it. So Pete Fellows could provide it for your community to look at, and I have it too. So I can do that too. So if you want to peek at that relative to the high school or something like that, but that's not all the changes in town, but it's the main stem. Kevin,
Okay.
you got a comment on that?
I'm pretty sure Pete has seen that data. I don't know. I can't speak for him offhand, but I'm pretty sure that we have seen those studies, which are, even though that is a flood study, it is not a FEMA flood study, just so folks are clear. So it's not yet become a map.
That's
But
what happened, right?
chances
Exactly.
are what we see is what we're going to end up being.
Likely,
Okay.
yeah, this is it. So, but for that one, yeah, for the main stem. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And Kyle, you have handouts and stuff. You want to talk about that and how we can follow up? I'm sure.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you very much, Ned, for the presentation. It's always wonderful and informative. And yes, so I'm gonna just drop a couple handouts into the chat, and you should be able to get them from there if it will allow me to drop them in. Let's see. Doesn't seem to be usually with Teams, Ned. You're on mute.
May need to be a link, I'm afraid.
They need to be a link. Okay, I'm gonna link them. But these are just they help to summarize a lot of what Ned has been discussing today. Give me one moment. And so you should be able to download this. And please, if someone can just check it and make sure, let me know if you have trouble getting it. I can always send it by email as well, but these also contain a number of links that will be important to follow up with, including the rollout of the new flood maps page that Ned discussed in his presentation.
Looks good, Kyle. Came right through. Yep.
Okay, and here's the second one. All right, and then you can follow up with me with questions if you're looking to, if you think you're interested in making some updates to your bylaw, making a few changes. You can always reach out to me. Ned is also available as the regional floodplain manager. And yeah, that's along with the flood regulations, just making sure that the hazard mitigation plan is up to date and the town plan as well, because in order to adopt new flood regulations, you need to have one or the other. But yeah, please follow up with me if there's interest. It's always good to get a head start on this earlier rather than waiting to that 6-month window. But yes, thank you everyone for being here this evening. That's pretty much it for me. I don't know if Ned, you have anything else you'd like to say, or
No,
I think
that's
we're
great. But
okay.
thank you so much for the handout. I'm sure that's going to be really helpful. So thanks very much for letting me come. Take care, everybody. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ned. And thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. We'll stop recording at some point. Figure out how to do that. Stop recording. There we go.